Welcome to the program. Mickey Osterreicher joins me. He is the General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association, and he's in Charlottesville right now. Mickey, we're so fortunate you're here for the Look 3 Festival of the
Yes.
Photograph. You're in town with a bunch of friends and enjoying all sorts of events at this annual festival in Charlottesville. You and I have spoken on the radio a number of times, and I want to have a conversation about journalism, photography, police, First Amendment rights, drones, body cams.
This is going to turn
dash
into a
cams.
5-hour series.
We're going to try to do this in less than 30 minutes.
Okay.
Let me start with what crosses your mind when we see protests in the streets, when we see photographers and journalists who take to the streets to cover the protests and end up becoming in not a few cases, the victims of police brutality. They get arrested for trying to do their jobs. What crosses your mind as their lawyer when you see this kind of thing happening in America, supposedly the place that was created specifically where that wouldn't happen?
Well, it's something I've been trying to avoid happening. I mean, as a good lawyer, I think not having photographers get arrested or battered or assaulted is really my goal. And so I would much rather just be kind of the Maytag repairman sitting there by the phone and it doesn't ring. And to that end, back in 2012, I did training in Tampa and Charlotte in preparations for we're talking about protests, and probably the ones that are coming up real soon are the ones we'll probably see now in Cleveland and Philadelphia at the RNC and the DNC.
At the big conventions.
At the big convention. So back in 2012, we thought that this would be a good idea because in 2008, in Denver and St. Paul, at those conventions, kind of at the start of the Occupy movement, there were lots of demonstrations, really the first time we'd seen big ones since the Vietnam protests. And the thing that had changed since then is everybody had a camera, whereas back then it was mainstream media were the only ones. And they had a few head bashings in Chicago in '68 and things like that. But we were trying to avoid having what happened in Denver and St. Paul, where there were quite a number of journalists arrested, and it cost those cities $100,000 and $200,000 respectively to settle the civil rights lawsuits that ensued from those.
Sure.
After all the charges were dropped, of course, also. So I did the training in Chicago to start at the NATO summit, and then again in Charlotte and Tampa. And fortunately, in Chicago, we only had one photographer, Getty photographer, arrested.
When you say you did the training,
you're
sitting down with police officers.
So I'll back up a little bit. It's great to talk to journalists, it's great to talk to citizens, it's great to talk to lots of people and tell them about their First Amendment rights. But I kind of quickly decided that if the police didn't know or didn't care what those rights were, it didn't matter. Whether somebody's going, I know what my constitutional rights are. Yeah, right. Put your hands behind your back.
Yeah.
You're under arrest. And so I thought it would be really helpful, and it turned out that it was, to do the training with these police agencies about First Amendment rights. And as I start with my training, I look at it as like chicken soup. It may not help, but it doesn't hurt. And for me at least, I feel like I'm somewhat uniquely situated. I was a photojournalist for about 40 years in print and broadcast. I've also been, and still am, a uniformed reserve sheriff's deputy in Erie County, New York. So I have some 40 years of law enforcement background. I'm not out there. I know how difficult a
Plus
job
legal
it is.
training as an attorney.
And as an attorney, so that's kind of what's enabled me to get my foot in the door with these police agencies. And that's what I'm going to be doing again in Cleveland and Philadelphia. Now, that's not to say it hasn't been difficult negotiating, but what's been interesting when I finally got to the right people, whereas in Tampa and Charlotte, I did like one session. They're like so excited that in Cleveland, I'm doing 3 days of 4 sessions every day. And then in Philly, I'm doing 4 sessions on one day. So they want to try and get as many officers exposed to this concept as close to...
Now, is that a good sign, Mickey? You think that law enforcement is Are you seeing law enforcement over the years becoming more receptive to training in what's called constitutional policing?
Well, fortunately, even though we're still seeing far more issues regarding that than I want to see, when you actually talk to the command staff, they do get it. I mean, we all take an oath to uphold the Constitution when we get sworn in as officers.
Right.
And what we're talking about is exactly what you swore to uphold. So, you know, they get it. They also, again, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. And the easy way is to respect those rights. The hard way is getting sued. Cities, municipalities don't have that kind of money to throw away.
They don't want to get sued for this stuff.
They don't want to get sued for this stuff. I mean, Cleveland is already under a consent decree from the DOJ, Department of Justice. And so they're being very mindful of, hey, if we can do something preventative, and it's not like I'm charging them, I've got a grant, it's not like I'm trying to sell them something.
Right.
It's like, hey, and they're like, really? You're not charging? No, I just want to come there because it's kind of a win-win-win. It's like, you guys get to do your job and not sued. Journalists get to do their job and not arrested. And the citizens also get to exercise their rights, because when you're out in a public place, journalists don't have any greater rights than the public. Everybody, you know, there's no reasonable expectation of privacy in a public place, which is why we are photographed and recorded dozens, scores of times a day by surveillance cameras, whether they're fixed ones, whether they're dash cams, whether they're police body cams. So if citizens want to take a camera and just stand there and kind of bear witness, then that's something that they're allowed to do.
Now, you mentioned something earlier, Mickey. You said in this day and age, everybody's got a camera, and that's certainly true. I've got one sitting right over there. You have one sitting right over there on our phones.
Yes.
We've never existed in a time when that was possible. It was always specific training. I mean, we can go back to the 30s and 40s when somebody had a camera. You had to find somebody who had a camera. It was a very rare thing. But now everyone's walking around with a camera on their phone. That truly has changed the game in a profound way when we talk about cameras in the streets, when we talk about photojournalism. It truly has changed the game in so many ways.
Well, for both good and bad, unfortunately. You know, the fact that hundreds of millions of images get uploaded to just Facebook. We'll just pick one social media site a day, daily.
Every day.
Every day. People, you know, it's certainly
staggering.
It's devalued pictures. It's devalued because people think, you know, well, everybody has a camera, everybody takes pictures. Everything on the internet is free, you know, it's the public domain, which it isn't.
Right.
And that's the good news and the bad news is even in the seminal case on the right to record out of the First Circuit, the Glick case, the court noted that it's just as likely that news today is going to come from somebody with a camera as from somebody with a press credential. I mean, you think about when a flight attendant goes crazy at 30,000 feet on an airliner, well, you can't get a camera crew in there, but it's going to be the person,
all the phones come
one
out.
of the passengers. When an Italian ocean liner capsizes, they're not racing a camera crew out there, it's the people that are on the ship. So a lot of those things come, and there's certainly a place for user-generated content. But there's also a really important place for professional photojournalism, for people that have training, that have ethics, that, you know, are very mindful of the fact that this is a job and a responsibility and a profession, and they need to do that well. And unfortunately, as we've seen, you know, newspapers, television stations, everyone is like getting rid of staff. And either using freelancers or, hey, send us your pictures. I'm sorry if, you know, it's done here, but that's, I mean, as I said, they serve a great purpose, but they can't really ever, as far as I'm concerned, replace professional photojournalists.
Remind us what the Glick case was about. For those who aren't familiar with this case, so incredibly important. Every American citizen should know about this case. So take a moment to remind us what that was about and what are the key takeaways.
So, and I love talking about this case because if I was to write a fact pattern, I couldn't do a better one. And so Simon Glick comes to this country as a little boy from the Soviet Union for the very freedoms that we're talking about here. And he grows up, and one day he is walking through Boston Commons, the cradle of our liberty, when he hears somebody shout, "Stop, you're hurting him." And he turns around and he sees 3 Boston police officers trying to effectuate an arrest. And so he whips out his BlackBerry. Some of us may remember.
I
what
remember
those are,
that, yes.
and kind of assumes the position. And it's either you need reading glasses or you're taking a picture. It's one of those 2 things.
Right.
And he records the arrest. And when they're done arresting the guy, one of them looks over at him and he says, "Did you record us?" And he said, "Yes, you're under arrest." And in Massachusetts, they have a wiretap statute. And the wiretap statute says you can't record audio surreptitiously. They also charged him with disorderly conduct and aiding in the escape of a prisoner.
For just standing there and recording the police.
Just for standing there and recording. So at any rate, charges get dismissed. He brings a federal civil rights lawsuit against the officers and against the Boston Police Department for negligent training and supervision. What happens in almost all of these civil rights cases is that the police will assert what's called qualified immunity, which basically says either the law was not clearly established, that right to record was not clearly established, and a reasonable officer in our place, wouldn't have known that it was not okay to photograph us. And the lower federal court said they weren't buying it. They said, no, the right was clearly established, and you should have known better. And so they appealed up to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and that basically covers the New England area. And they issued a 24-page decision, which you can read, and it's in very plain English. It's not all convoluted. But it basically upheld the fact that, no, they don't get qualified immunity, and both the press and the public have what they call a coextensive right to photograph and record. The only exception that they actually qualified a little is traffic stops. But that's not what we're talking about here, because they look at those as an inherently dangerous situation, and we haven't seen some rulings where we actually have some. But we're going to just talk about being on the street in a traditionally public place where you have a legal right to be present.
Well, the citizen has no right to privacy in a public place, given all the cameras that
Correct,
can be
that's
installed.
what I just said.
And so what would make the police think that they are the only ones on the street that have a right to privacy?
What they thought was under the wiretap statute, that since, well, first of all, he wasn't recording surreptitiously, because when he was open and notorious
standing right
about
there
it,
in front of
they
him.
asked him, he didn't lie about it. So there was a problem there for them. But they were still trying to rely on that, and the court said, no, when you're out in public, the wiretap statute was really made for telephonic communication, not when you're in public, where there is no expectation of privacy.
Right.
And so that's why they were not able to kind of nuance around that.
And it's not
that
to
fact.
deny that every member of law enforcement isn't trying to do an impossibly tough job. Let's admit that up front. But we also need to constantly remind power that citizens have rights, that this country was created specifically as a nation where citizens would have absolute rights that the government was created to protect. And they need to be reminded, and it's our job to remind them.
And the good part of this is in a he said, she said, where what did you see if you're just a witness? And you say, the police were using excessive force, or they were acting unprofessionally. Before the cameras, it was your word against the police officers. And there was a presumption that an officer would be telling the truth. Nowadays, it's like, let's just go to the videotape.
It's totally changed.
And
that
has somewhat leveled the playing field. Now, coming back around the other end, there are many officers and departments that say, but you didn't see what led up to the recording. The recording started here, but the incident started here, which is one of the reasons that so many departments are now going to body cams. And the body cams are interesting because they buffer. They're constantly recording. But until the officer actually hits the record button, what it will do is save the 30 seconds it had previously recorded and then go on from there. So, a lot of times people don't hit the record button until something's happened already. The hope here is because of that buffering system, that the police will have what led up to this, and it depends on...
And there's been real complaints about body cam video that's magically disappeared, or audio from police recording that's magically disappeared of the moment of the actual event.
Right, whether it's dash cam or not. But I think for the most part, when people see the recordings, there's a better sense of exactly what happened, rather than like what we saw in Ferguson, where there was no recording with Michael Brown. And we saw what resulted in that. Whereas in New York, you know, where we had that whole chokehold thing.
Eric Garner, yeah.
With Eric Garner. It was on video, and even though there were people obviously very upset about it, it was, at least you saw it. It wasn't all this conjecture. Did he have his hands up? Did he not have his hands? Was he, you know, all of those things, it's like you just got to see it for yourself, which is really the important
So the takeaway, we're going to take a quick break here, but the takeaway from the Glick case is that American citizens have every right to videotape members of law enforcement in the conduction of their duties in a public place.
As long as they're, A, not physically interfering with the officer's ability to do the job, so that recording in itself does not constitute interference. And B, that's just for the First Circuit, and there are other circuits around the country that have held that, but there are some circuits that have had contrary rulings, and there are some circuits that have been silent on it. So it depends on what part of the country you're in. We haven't gotten the Supreme Court to address that
that's
case.
why we have a Supreme Court, right? When law conflicts like that?
They have not taken that case yet, and
they're not going to with 8 members.
And with a 4-4 decision, which we could have, it won't settle anything anyway.
No, they're not going to take the tough ones. Let's take a quick break, and when we get back, I want to ask you about drones. We're talking with Mickey Osterreicher of the National Press Photographers Association. I'm Coy Barefoot. Stay with us. We will be right back. Welcome back. We are talking with Mickey Osterreicher of the National Press Photographers Association, where he serves as the general counsel. Let me ask you about drones. I know the FAA has weighed in and said you practically have to be a pilot to operate what was once a kid's play toy and an adult hobby kind of thing. You know, we used to call them remote control planes. Now we call them drones. It's very fascinating how this language has changed. But what's sort of new is now it's very easy to put a camera on these things. And there's some very real threats, obviously some questions of implications of privacy rights and First Amendment rights. And we are here in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was the first municipality on the planet that actually issued a resolution not denying, it's very careful to point this out, a lot of the press got it wrong, not denying the use of drones in Charlottesville, but saying that they wanted to make sure that if they were used, that privacy rights were protected. What, from your standpoint, Mickey, what should Americans understand about the use of drones by photographers, by journalists going on today? So,
I've been very involved in this for quite a number of years now, because I look at it as another tool in a photographer's toolkit. Do you want to use a wide angle lens to tell the story better? Do you want to use a telephoto lens to tell the story? Whatever you need. So many times you really need to just get up a few feet, not necessarily, you know, hundreds of feet, but just to get that overall view. Think about the fact there's a natural disaster. What happens? Governor comes in, president comes in. First thing they do, they take to the air so they can see much better than standing on the ground the extent of the damage, the hurricane, the tornado, the fire, the whatever. So it's only natural. I mean, man has always wanted to fly, and right around the same time as hot air balloons took men up tethered in France and Paris, another inventor came up with, I think I can figure out a way to take a picture. The camera obscura, same. And it really wasn't long till somebody said, well, now that we got cameras, let's put one in a hot air balloon. So, you know, the first aerial photographs were taken of Paris in the 1700s,
Right.
and then in Boston. So everybody's always wanted to get those area views. And as you said, we've had remotely controlled aircraft. Hobbyists have been flying these things for like 60 years. But it's only just recently that we've got the ability to lift the payload of a camera that's got high definition quality video or still images for a relatively cheap price. And of course now there are all the privacy concerns. And my favorite story,
And understandably so.
And understandably so.
Let's not dismiss them outright.
But
real privacy concerns.
But I have to tell you, I laugh to myself if it wasn't, so serious, because things are just cyclical. Because in the late 1800s, when George Eastman invented the Brownie, the exact same thing happened. Prior to him inventing this cheap, easily available camera, people either were like Matthew Brady, that had a big covered wagon and huge cameras, and they took pictures that way, or you went to a photographer's studio and sat with your neck in a brace and held still for a few minutes, because that's how long an exposure was.
Right.
And there was the exact same hue and cry from the public. Oh my God, the right to privacy as we know it is over. And there were signs up at beaches. Now think about this. In the late 1800s, people wore more to the beach than they wear to church today. But there were signs, no brownies. Brownies are banned. And so Louis Brandeis and Samuel Warren, who were both Harvard law students at the time, wrote this treatise called A Right to Privacy. You go online, Google it, you can read it. If you read it, you would think they're writing about drones today. They talk about the snooping press and the nosy neighbors and all the same things that people are worried about. Now go back to what we were just talking before in the last segment. When you're out in public, there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. So whether you're standing on the ground, think about this. I'm standing here and I got a camera in my hand. I can take your picture out in a public place, public sidewalk. Now, I'm flying a drone at the same height as my head, 6 feet off the ground. I wish I was 6 feet off. Anyway, but all of a sudden, because it's a new technology, I can't take the picture. And so those are the kinds of things that we've been addressing. The problem with the FAA is they're saying all these don'ts. But in 2012, Congress mandated them to safely integrate the use of UAS, unmanned aerial systems, that's the proper name for drones, anything under 55 pounds, and do that. Well, it's now actually, they've pushed the deadline back, and today is the 17th, isn't it? I think, whatever. Maybe that's, I'm sorry. They've already passed, this other deadline that they had set for themselves. So we don't know when we're going to see a final rule, but eventually we will. And then I'm sure it's going to.
It's been years.
It's been years.
Congress said,
they haven't done what they're supposed to do, and that's just on the safety issue. So the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, NTIA, was mandated by the president to look into the privacy concerns. And I was on those committees that had those meetings, and one of the things that we were found very important to do was to say that these best practices do not apply to First Amendment protected activities. And we have that exception because we want to be able to use them for news gathering and not be limited by some of the best practices. There are a lot of people now who think that you have a privacy interest in your facial features. And even if you're in public, that should be private. And we don't want to see that created. There are a lot of countries you do need permission. In France, you can't take somebody's picture out in public if you don't ask their permission. So it's
under third world dictators, you have to go to the government and say, "Can I use my camera in your country?"
And that's the last thing we want to see happening, whether it's on the ground or in the air.
It'll be very good for journalism to have, as you say, to have that tool in the toolbox to be able to lift a camera up. It would be incredible.
Absolutely.
And it's just not right that they can't use them now. That's my own personal
feeling. And it's safer
feeling.
and it's more economic. Television stations that in the big markets that have a helicopter, that's one thing. But even, let's say in Los Angeles, it makes no sense when there's a forest fire 100 miles away from the station and you've sent a crew out there to now fly your Bell Jet Ranger out at whatever cost it is, and danger, because we've seen news helicopters crash, unfortunately, with fatal circumstances. And you've got a crew on the ground. Now you've flown this out. He's going to get, a minute's worth of footage and fly back again. It makes much more sense to the crew that's there to take the drone out of the trunk and get the same thing, bring it back down. Obviously, coordinate with the firefighters. You don't want to be launching these things while some of the planes are coming in to try and, drop retardant. But, that can all be done. And that makes much more sense. And it allows newspapers and television stations and freelance photographers to do exactly the same thing and levels that playing field.
Mickey, let me ask you about your take on the state of journalism. As we, let's pull the camera back here and look at the broader view of the health of journalism in America today, from where you sit and the men and women you work with, the journalists that you work with. What's going on in the industry and in the profession today from the broad view, good or bad, that the rest of us should know about?
It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. We've been talking about First Amendment rights, the right of access, kind of at the front end. If you can't take a picture, then there's nothing to talk about. You can't shoot some video, end of discussion. But I'm also very involved with the back end, with the fact that, as I said, staff photography positions are becoming few and far between. Sports Illustrated laid off all their wonderful shooters. The Chicago paper got rid of their whole staff. So they're relying more and more on freelance. Those freelancers are faced with, trying to provide for their families, food on the table, college education for their children, all of those things. And with all these images that are being uploaded, it's really devalued photography. So trying to actually earn a fair living from your work is very difficult. That's compounded with, if you put something up on the internet, even if it's yours and it's professional and you've got it watermarked and you've done all the things that you need to do, people think, just like they did for many years, that, oh, music, I'll just take the music. And the music industry did a really good job of educating people. Well, you wouldn't walk into a record store, which don't exist anymore, but and steal a record, because that's exactly, you're stealing our music. People are stealing pictures that they do not have a right to. And it's unfortunate because the only way for some photographers to make a living is, besides getting paid a very reduced day rate, they might be able to resell that picture, but they can't resell it if it's out there for free. So one of the things that the National Press Photographers Association and a number of visual artists associations have been working on is a Small Claims Copyright Act. The Copyright Office came out in favor of it in 2013. I think we'll see legislation proposed actually in the next 2 weeks or so. I have no idea what's going to happen with the bill, because I'm sure we're going to get tremendous pushback from large groups, the Microsofts and the Googles, who unfortunately have found a way to monetize the work of all these people. And whether they make fractions of a cent on a dollar, they're still making billions and billions of dollars, because people go, because images drive page views. People read stuff, but they look at the images more. And so it's that thing that really is something that concerns me in terms of the viability
That's
of the
something we absolutely need to figure out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the courts and Congress need to weigh in, lawmakers.
We hope.
Clear this up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mickey, thank you for being here, man.
It was a pleasure.
It's been a lot of fun.
Okay.
Mickey Osterreicher, he is the General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association. I'm Coy Barefoot. You can find the complete archive of our program online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.